Fáilte raibh gach aine an seo máte inniu tá sé iontach rá leis an seminar seo. You're all really welcome back to Maynooth for this seminar this morning. Myself and Professor Rob Boyle have been advancing a series of seminars over the last while, and this is our first seminar of 2025, and it's great to be doing so. We have a number of people online, obviously, as well as in person, and we're recording this and it'll be available afterwards. And this is the first of 5 seminars in the first half of 2025. So it's great to see so many people here. Thanks especially to those people who've traveled to be here. It's great to see that. Just want to give obviously a special welcome to somebody who hasn't had to travel too far, Professor Rob Kitchin, whose office is maybe the second closest office to this room in the building, but it's great that he has given up his time to be here, and to Niall Cussen, the Chief Executive in the Office of the Planning Regulator. So it's great that you're both here, who also hasn't had to travel very far, but has to travel far immediately afterwards. So thanks very, very much. We in this series today, we've been looking at examples of really academics and policymakers working together, usually on a particular project, but we've tried to expand the nature of the series with some of the examples that we're planning for now. And this is a good example of it. Rather than focusing on a single piece of work, we really want to talk, and Professor Kitchin will set it out really about work over a career of engaging with policymaking in different ways and the relevance of research to policymaking. And then Niall is an example of somebody who he has worked with in that regard, and we'll also have examples of working with researchers beyond Rob. So we just kind of move informally into that, and we don't have formal presentations. It's really chat.
Yeah.
And so over to you, Rob.
Okay, thanks for the invitation. So yeah, I was going to ask to kind of talk about kind of engagement around policy kinds of stuff, or really with external stakeholders, I guess, over the career. So I have done kind of policy, long history of doing policy work, but also developing tools and infrastructures and doing kind of activism, advocacy kinds of work as well, and some media work. So just to give a brief history. So I really kind of started engaging, I guess, with external stakeholders seriously around 1997, working with the Irish Wheelchair Association, Newbridge Access Group, and a bunch of disability organisations in the north. So I had a Royal Irish Academy grant that was looking at disability services on either side of the border. And then kind of when I took over as director of NERSA here in 2002, would be when I was starting to pick up more collaboration around spatial planning. And this is obviously the link with Niall, who at the time would have been in the department, I think, Department of what was then Environment, and then whatever comes afterwards, which changes every government.
Community and local government.
Yeah. And that was something that I joined and kind of inherited. And I think that's important in terms of some of the things we might talk about later on, because the Institute came with some resources, and it came with networks, and it came with already existing links, principally through Jim, but other people within, in relation to spatial planning, but other people within the Institute at the time. I think Jerry Boyle and Mary Corcoran and a whole bunch of other people already had existing links outside of the university, and so I kind of inherited some of that. And it's important to say these were institutional bids, institutional organisations, not simply just with the stakeholders. So NERSA involved 8 institutions. It's like ourselves, and I think it was Queen's, Mary Immaculate, Galway Mayo, Institute of Technology, Waterford Institute of Technology, Mary Immaculate College. There was a bunch of stuff. And I think that's important, is that kind of network of resources and networks that can be drawn upon to help people leverage into those networks to develop their connections. Not long after that, 2003, 2004, we started the ICLRD, International Centre for Local Regional Development. This is cross-border. So this is really coming off the peace process, looking at cross-border spatial planning in the context of the peace process, working with the North South Ministerial Council, local authorities, regional authorities, some government departments. And typically I would have been in the north about once a month, going up and down to go and interact with the stakeholders. So it was fairly involved kinds of work. Again, multi-institutional on the higher education side. So like ourselves, Harvard University, University of Ulster, Queen's, Centre for Cross-Border Studies, and so on. Not long after that, we set up AERO, All Ireland Research Observatory. This is more data infrastructure tools. Again, working with cross-border, again, working with local authorities, regional authorities, trying to help them build data tools, data infrastructure that would give them the evidence base to see what was going on in their local area and be able to compare themselves with their neighbours and so on. And Niall would have been involved in all three of those, NERSA, ICLRD and AERO, all linked into things like the National Spatial Strategy that was happening at that time, the peace processes, cross-border spatial planning. So there were real kinds of large-scale things going on in the country that we were trying to connect in on and help provide either policy kind of advice or tools or infrastructures that would help with that. And the important thing to say about those three is they're all still active. So Caroline is still running ICLRD, Justin Gleeson is running AERO, NERSA has now become Muzzy and expanded to become faculty-wide, was already faculty-wide institute, but a wider, broader institute that involves another set of centres up here. So the Kennedy Institute's up here. There's a bunch of other centres linked into that. And then after that, I kind of took a bit of a break away from spatial planning kinds of stuff and went off and helped set up the Digital Repository of Ireland. So I kind of wrote the bid for that initiative. And that's working with the GLAM sector, so completely different sector. So galleries, libraries, archives, museums, and RTE. So like National Archives, the National Museums, galleries, they were all the stakeholders in that bid to set up a digital repository. So kind of, similar kind of, AERO was kind of a spatial data repository. This is a kind of qualitative cultural heritage kinds of repository. Again, 6 higher education institutions. And I kind of have a role basically getting the money. So doing a lot of going into different government departments and agencies trying to find the money to make that into a sustainable entity. We were given 5 years of money for a 100-year project. We were told it had to last 100 years, but we're only going to give you 5 years of money. So my job was basically to go and hassle people to try and get the additional money. And then going later on, so 2013, I'm running a big project called Programmable City, so into smart city stuff. So kind of back to spatial planning, spatial urban kinds of things, working with Smart Dublin was the principal stakeholder and the Dublin local authorities. And 2016 is building city dashboards. That's the 4 Dublin local authorities, the 2 Cork authorities, the CSO and Ordnance Survey Ireland with the main stakeholders in that project, building the dashboards for the 2 cities. And then my more recent project, one that's currently ongoing, is called Data Stories, which is all about housing and planning data. And that's got about 80 stakeholders in it that we've interviewed or spoken to at the minute. There's about 10 or 12 we're working with quite closely. So I think we're up to about 175 interviews, I don't know how many workshops, 10 or 15 workshops at this stage. So we're all members of the team are basically engaging a lot with these external stakeholders and talking to them, working with them, running workshops with them, and so on. So that's my kind of career of going in and out of this kinds of stuff. And just, I guess, quickly, some kinds of, kind of reflections or lessons from that. So my personal motivation around this is basically, I want to learn things. So I want to know if I'm going to write about what's going to happen with these things, like the best people to go and talk to are the people doing it. So I want to engage with them and I want to have conversations with them. I also want to change things. Like I want better spatial planning. I want good resources. I want better data. I want so And I think the most effective way to do that, in my experience, is to be on the inside. It's to be at the table and having the conversations and trying to influence the debate. I think throwing rocks from the outside and critiquing has its role, but it's not always that effective. And there's definitely a place for it, but I find actually being at the table and trying to influence things a much more productive way of making things happen. And at the same time, I'm always careful to leverage all of this stuff into what I would call mainstream academic outputs, into books, into journal articles, into whatever. I don't just sit in the policy space. I'm trying to do that translation, kind of critical thinking, intellectual work as well. In terms of the approach, so some of those were PI-led projects. Some of them were kind of institutional collaborations, and I think there's a difference between those kinds of things. And so sometimes we might have been applying for consultancy contracts, so they might be on tendered or whatever, and we'd have applied for them. Sometimes it might be us directly contacting stakeholders and saying, can we come and talk to you about this? And you know, can we interview you? Can we talk to you? Can we collaborate with you? And so on. It could be, in some cases, be a joint application. So particularly stuff like ICLRD and so on, like an Aero, like we needed external stakeholders to be part of the bid to be able to get the money. So they were collaborative bids to secure resources, basically. And that also happened with the DRI. We had to all that GlamSect were named stakeholders on the bid. So there was a lot of consultation with them before the bid actually went in, as well as afterwards. It could be involving stakeholders on the boards or advisory groups or steering groups of committees. So Niall would have served on the board of NERSA in the first incarnation back in, I guess, around 2001. And in a lot of cases, we're often doing work for an agency or a local authority that have been contracted to do that work for them. So it's not a co-creation project. They've given us a task, we go away, and then we report it back. We do co-creation stuff as well, but like, you know, the relationship differs. If it's a straight contract, there might be a steering group or an oversight group or a whatever, you know, we just get used to that. My advice about, I guess, getting started is start local. So don't aim to get into a government department as your first point of contact. Aim to get into Kildare County Council or a local access group here or a community development group here or whatever, and then basically work a way up a ladder. So it's local authorities to regional authorities to government departments, you know, like, and start building networks and start building contacts, and contacts also progress. You know, so Niall is now CEO of the OPR. His career has progressed as so like that. Those early networks also expand to become larger networks. I do think there are these network effects. Like when I took over the institute here, I benefited greatly from Jim's existing contacts to what then I think was a CLRD, who were doing work around the NSS, so National Spatial Strategy. They've been doing works with local authorities around things like economic development plans, county development plans, that kind of work. And so I benefited off the network. Brendan Bartley was another key person at that time as well, who'd worked in the department and worked outside the university before coming into the university, and had a series of networks where people could connect you in. And so I think it is about finding other people in the university or finding other people within you that you can kind of leverage the network off of. Like, do you know, can you introduce me to, can you, like, I think that's really powerful. I think we have had a kind of an apprenticeship model running within the institute. Caroline would be a product of that. Justin would be a product of that. Like if I was going to meetings, we would take all the junior colleagues with us. We would pass on media work. We would pass on other kinds of, we would try to get them involved as PIs on the project or co-Is on the project, and so on. So there was a notion of which we would bring. So I'm no longer involved really with Aero or ICLRD. They're run separately with people who we took on. So Justin's been there 20 whatever years. Caroline's been there 20 years, I guess. has to be a give and take relationship, I think, if you're working with stakeholders. Like, it has to be not just us going in and mining out knowledge and information and then publishing it and whatever. Like, it has to be trying to help solve problems that they have, give them something that they want. Like, I can't be an extractive relationship basically from our side. Now, saying that there are tensions between university research and external stakeholder expectations and needs. So there's some things I think need to be wary of as well. So things like NDAs and publishing agreements, they can be quite tricky. It can be very tricky if they don't really want you to publish what you've been finding out. So we try to negotiate that in advance. And I'm not doing it if there's an NDA. I'll do it if there's a publishing agreement where we can negotiate what I can and I can't publish. But if there's just a blanket you can't publish, then I'm not doing it. Like, that's not the mission of this university. Like, the mission of a university is to be open and free and be able to express their views. I think just be aware that there are different audiences and expectations. Like, if you're writing for a government minister, you're writing a page, maybe two. It's going to be in a different voice, a different kind of register. If you're giving a presentation to county councillors, you're presenting in a different register, and I think you just have to get used to the idea that you write in different styles and voices, and you present material, whether it's graphs or maps or whatever it is, in a slightly different way. And I do think you need to be prepared to work through differences and tension points. Like, there definitely will be different views, different ideas about what a policy response should be, different interpretations of the data, different. I think probably I like, when the crisis happened and we were writing a lot around ghost estates and vacancy and stuff, and we had contracts with the Department of Environment at the time, that was a tension point.
Nama Wine Lake?
Nama Wine Lake was not us. But if he was us, that would definitely be a tension point. And then doing things like media work can cause issues. Like, if you're doing media work around stuff you've been doing with the stakeholder and you're openly critiquing them in public, then that can create some interesting issues. I also think you just have to accept that there's some things you won't win. Like, I do want to change things, and like, often I can't get anywhere, and you have to compromise. And I just think that you just have to accept that that's the reality. I don't think that means you give up on your principles or your values or your ethos or the way you go about doing things. It's just the reality of you're in a political space, and stakeholders have different positions, and you just have to negotiate that. But I still think it's better being on the inside, having that conversation and argument and fight, than just being on the outside throwing rocks. Niall, do you want to?
That's over to Niall.
Thanks, Rob. We shouldn't have had that cup of coffee last week because you've stolen all my flip. And I'm only joking. And it's really lovely to be here. Lovely to be here at Maynooth University. As Seán said, I didn't have to come that far, and I always feel very much at home here in Maynooth University, having sort of traipsed around its campus or lived in the community since the early 1980s. So I suppose this is also a very interesting opportunity to have a conversation between those in the research community and those in the policy, and in the delivery space. And I think after 37 years, or whatever it is, working in that space, I think I have maybe an interesting perspective to share with you. And I'm going to be very brief because I think the Q&A afterwards might be a little bit more interesting. And I see some familiar faces around, indeed colleagues and friends of many decades. But I don't know everybody in the audience, so I don't quite know what the mix is in terms of, I suppose, the researchers and those actually working in policy. And of course there's an online audience as well. But I think it is very important that we have, I suppose, spaces like this to, talk openly around, I suppose, challenges and opportunities we both have to inhabit, and I suppose some of the issues that arise in relation to navigating those. As I mentioned, I'm a professional planner by background. I did my undergraduate degree here in Maynooth University in geography and economics. First economics class in 1987, indeed, or first graduates in 1987. But very much with a view to going forward into the professional planning education. Indeed, it was my career guidance teacher and geography teacher I've often talked about that highlighted the importance of going to Maynooth, because it had this very interesting nexus of research, advocacy, and engagement. I see Chris Van Egret here, Proinsias Brannock, a whole load of writers down through the years have had, profound, I suppose, influences in relation to policy thinking and so on, going back a long way. And that's what drew me to Maynooth and into a planning career. And then obviously a journey through rural and urban local authorities, on board Planala, and then ending up in the Custom House on January 6, 2000, around the mission of building Ireland's first spatial planning framework, really, comprehensive spatial planning framework, the National Spatial Strategy. And from there, things developed in the context of joining the staff of the department. I went into the department as a Bord Planala inspector, indeed, on secondment, but then took a full-time role there and ended up as chief planner in the department, and then moved out of the department in 2019 to establish the Office of the Planning Regulator, ironically an entity whose legislation I was working very closely on for many years, 12 years indeed, as the legislation for the establishment of the Independent Planning Regulator wound its way slowly through the Oireachtas, and that probably tells its own story. I suppose throughout that career, and particularly I suppose at departmental level and subsequently, there has, in my view, been a real blossoming of a relationship between the research community and policy in the planning and development space. Others have mentioned about the national space. You mentioned, Rob, the National Spatial Strategy. I suppose just to mark that was part of a sort of an evolution of or maturity of planning from being seen as largely a regulatory function. You have to get planning permission. You get called to the court if you don't do something without planning permission, or if you do something without planning permission. But I suppose real in-depth research around planning, apart from Forest Farbaha, which obviously played a crucial role at a particular point in time, had surged and then waned. And I suppose at the time I came into the department, there really was a significant dearth or paucity of real spatial understanding of the functioning of the country and so on. And of course, very much the thinking in the department at the time was influenced by the emergence of the European spatial development perspective. Jim and others will cover that far more comprehensively than I, because they were intimately involved around that time. And that, spurred on, I suppose, thinking within the department, and indeed more widely within the civil service and the public service generally, that it was time to think a little bit more deeply around spatial development patterns and so on, and the role of planning and spatial planning in the broadest of senses in managing those over time. Maybe controversially, that there might have been a sense internally in the department at that time that I suppose in the planning research community, thinking of various planning schools that were there, and indeed thinking of UCD that was established by the UN development program, under the Whittaker economic development sort of era and all of that. Academia, like what you were saying there, Rob, academia was very often thinking or conversing or engaging in circles outside of the gritty business of policy making. You were talking about throwing rocks, whatever about throwing rocks, but certainly there really wasn't a venue where the different points of view came together. So the decision to prepare a national spatial strategy was a great opportunity to sort of reboot that relationship. And as I said, Jim and others will tell a much deeper story about how we even got to that point, which is fascinating. But that's really not the purpose of today. So I was part of a small team of professional planners working under Dom Hegarty, who was the principal advisor in planning at the time. Mary Boyle was the assistant secretary. And Ken Mohini, who indeed was my immediate line manager. So myself and Ian Douglas, Kieran Tracy, and others were involved in a program of, devising a research series. So there were research papers, and briefs in terms of reference and so on. The gestation of which indeed, was founded on a lot of interaction with, people like yourselves and others in the first instance. But I think, if my memory serves me right, I think there were about 20 or 22 or something like that research papers. Some of them were internal, but a lot of them were procured. We went out to market. And indeed, organizations like Fitzpatrick Associates, who brought in, I suppose, researchers like Jim and others from Maynooth University and other universities, then started to generate, a remarkable array of material in relation to what had been going on in terms of the spatial functioning of the country. I always remember vividly, we worked through several ministers in the gestation of the NSS with Noah Dempsey and Martin Cullen and Dick Roach and others. But I always remember, literally the eyes popping out of the heads of politicians and senior public servants, Secretary General of the department, assistant secretaries, and so on. And not only in our department, but other departments, when literally they were seeing the spatial functioning of the country in a way that intuitively they probably understood themselves, hadn't actually seen it. I suppose the impact that had in giving, I suppose, the whole process of developing that policy a real impetus. And as you mentioned, Rob, that in turn, created a space in which entities started to emerge, within this institution, around ICLRD, NERSA, Aero, etc. And they continue to be really, really important features. Indeed, as I see Caroline there, we did a very, very good piece of work with you around, I suppose, what the spatial functioning of the country now looks like, post-COVID, where, significant chunks of us, whatever Elon Musk thinks, work from home or are based from home, and all the implications for that in terms of spatial development patterns, travel patterns, and so on. And more of that will be done into the future, as far as we're concerned, because the OPR, the Office of the Planning Regulator, has, to some extent, along in terms of our three functions, we have a regulatory function in relation to spatial planning and, I suppose, investigating issues that might arise in relation to individual local authorities, and all, as some of you may be aware. But we have a very important research, training, and public awareness function. So led by my colleague Karen Gallagher and her team on the RTPA team. And that is, driving forward with, a very, very broadly based program of research, which is, being conducted, through here and other institutions like it. So we've kind of stepped into that space that Forest Verba was in, and then I suppose left a vacuum after it was abolished and replaced partly by the Environmental Research Unit, and then ended up sort of in the EPA, etc. Just a couple of points then, I suppose. So that's kind of the potted history of, where I came from, I suppose the journey in relation to the linkages between planning and research, etc. But I'm going to steal back some of the things we discussed over coffee last week, and very conscious of the fact that, yes, we in the research community or in the policy community, we actually do share the same basic motivations. I think you put it brilliantly, Rob. I think in my experience working in the public service for nigh on 40 years, number one, of course, we are serving the public. But we're also, in that context, always trying to learn, trying to understand better what's going on, what are the issues, how do we address them? And you know, that whole piece around wanting to change things. You know, certainly when I came into the world of planning, and I came up through planning, working in local authorities all over this country, and then working in the board, Burton All as it was, and seeing the absence of a national spatial plan or framework, or whatever you want to call it, regional strategies, I was very gripped of, driven by the sense that this had to change. This idea of 88 local area plans, 88 individual development plans from the 88 local authorities there were in place prior to 2014. Was just really a very, very difficult context in which to mobilize the kinds of mega infrastructure and environmental and other programs we now need to do to address, you know, sort of many intertwined challenges around housing, climate, and so on. So, you know, the opportunity to literally getting the phone call from Don Hegarty in 1999 to come into the department to meet Noel Dempsey, etc., and get an opportunity to do something about that was, you know, just it was like winning the lotto, as they say today. So we're all in the same space. But yes, the whole piece around audiences, messaging, timescales, and all of that, and language, you know, are quite different. So I suppose, you know, whilst we have the same motivation in terms of, you know, revealing those key insights in terms of how to address wicked problems, or even more straightforward problems, you know, as I said, your context and our context, you know, can create tensions around that. So, you know, when I think about, for example, commissioning a piece of work in my role in the OPR, what draws me instinctively to the academic or the university sector, and it is that whole piece around independence, peer review, the fact that there's no vested interests. I'm going to be getting it, you know, straight from the core. You know, if I go out and I go to consultancy, it depends obviously, but, you know, very often it will draw, unless it's one of the really large ones, and that can often mean then very large bills, you know, it can draw from a quite confined skills base. In university, you know, think of it, an institution like this, Maynooth University, you know, social sciences, many different areas, business, law, etc. You know, engineering, a huge breadth of skills you can reach towards. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things is certainly the issue of audiences. And as somebody who's worked for, I think, 11 senior ministers and 24 ministers of state in various different settings down through the years, you learn quite quickly, I suppose, the importance of you know, being quite compelling, being quite clear, concise, etc. Because ministers, in fairness, and senior officials, you know, they are working under incredible pressure, mad timescales, competing, conflicting objectives, etc. So you've got to have that ability to cut through all of that noise, all of that distraction, to say, Minister, you really do need to see this, you know. And moreover, I'm not just coming to you with problems. We think we have a solution. So getting into that space around cutting through the noise, indeed, you know, having the smarts and the evidence to back it up, but also then that, you know, skill in terms of communicating what the solutions might be, understanding, and very much bringing into the thinking, you know, some of the political challenges, etc. That's, you know, that's gold territory. So a phrase I love always is the ability to walk in each other's shoes. You know, I get it absolutely from the research community. You know, the importance of, you are centers of learning. You are ultimately teaching people and furthering knowledge and education. You have to publish NDAs, all of that piece. Obviously, would be difficult. And we've got to maybe try and find ways where we can bridge across those gaps. You know, you're dealing with, in effect, peer-reviewed journals, published journals. You're dealing with, you know, similar academics or even more skilled academics. You know, when I was working in the department and you're bringing a piece to ministers or their advisors, etc., you know, you're dealing with a non-technical audience. The odd time you might be dealing with a somewhat technical audience, but generally speaking, they're coming at it not necessarily with the depth or the breadth of knowledge that you have. So to be very, very conscious of that. That feeds back into, I suppose, the whole research approach. So I think, you know, as I said, venues like this, opportunities like this are really, really important in terms of just, you know, communicating those different perspectives and finding ways for us to work more closely. And yeah, the culture piece, we talked about that last week. You know, I suppose what we've been doing, particularly in the department for quite a few years now, or certainly upon the time I was there, you know, we were trying to break out of the stereotype of, you know, ministers always just looking for shortcuts. You know, we were really in the whole research program, we were trying to put, you know, a serious evidential base to, I suppose, how ministers were and government departments were responding to societal issues and challenges and so on. And we also have to break out of and you touched upon this, Rob, the stereotype of, yeah, academics kind of living in some sort of, you know, cozy, insulated bubble, where, yeah, they can write loads of things and fire out the rockets left, right, and center. You know, and I'm not saying in this institution, but in other settings, it still amuses me, is one way to put it. At the ease with which, you know, people that we see writing in the papers every day or interviewed on the television, you know, will put out problems in relation to what the government is doing, or what this, that, and the other. And up there, I'm like, and your idea is, and it's not there, you know, so that's not good enough. It's not good enough. So we have to work together. And I think just in terms of closing remarks, I suppose, you know, that you mentioned it as well, Rob, about risks and that. And I just think that the opportunities for closer working between the research community and the policy community the opportunities far outweigh the risks. And, you know, as ESPON showed at EU level, the ESDP and the NSS and the MPF, if we can find ways, you know, to intelligently, thoroughly, concisely present the evidence in compelling ways, you can bring about change. You can bring around significant policy change. Look what we have in this country. We're one of the very few, as I keep saying it to anyone who listen, we're one of the very, very few countries in the world, and one of the small number in Europe that has effectively a conjoined national planning framework, national development plan. The vision is driving where the money is going. And it's not perfect, never will be perfect. It's always a continual process of evolution and improvement, but we have it. When, as I said, other countries, you know, have dismantled that sort of approach, gone different directions. And all of that didn't come about by an accident. You know, it came about through interactions like these, you know, literally standing on the shoulders of lots of people who have come before. And, you know, certainly in the planning area, there's this very, very rich now interaction between the policy area. Maybe it's not so rich in other areas of academic inquiry. Maybe that's something we'll discuss. But I think they're my overall remarks. Seán, and again, thanks for the opportunity.
Thanks very much to the two of you. Now, we're a little bit tighter for time than we normally are, because we have to be finished by 12:20. So just to say that at the start. But what I want to do first is bring in somebody who's been mentioned a few times, and you've talked about standing on his shoulders. And he's still very active here, despite being retired, and former deputy president of Maynooth, Professor Jim Walsh. So I'll just, you want to say a few things, Jim?
Thanks, John. I'm not sure if I need this, but I'll say.
You need it for the online.
Sorry?
You need it for the online.
Okay, all right. Yeah, sorry. I didn't join you for coffee last week, so I wasn't sure what you were going to say. I sat down and drafted some notes. There's some bit of overlap, so I will try to avoid the bullet points that have been covered. But I want to start by making the point that in terms of university engagement with the policy world, I think there are two categories of engagement for a start. There's what I would broadly call transformative and transactional. Transformative is deep, strategy focused, and will bring about if it is successful, significant changes for the benefit of society. Transactional is related more to one-off projects, some of which may be situated within a transformative framework, others may not. Now, the experiment that we've had here in Maynooth, which goes back to the 1990s, I would put in the transformative category, in that it's a long-term project and it has brought about significant results. And what I want to focus on for a few moments is the context for the start. How did it come about? Because I think if you want to go down that route, you need to start somewhere. Then what did Maynooth bring to the table? What kind of results were achieved? And some kind of overall assessment. So in terms of how did it begin? Thinking back to the early 1990s, Ireland was leading the way internationally in what was called local development. Where I had pioneered various strategies, but very quickly became obvious to me that local was not sufficient for regional. And that was not picked up by the political world. It was far too small, and the bigger problems remained within sectoral remits, and there was no joined up thinking at that scale. Secondly, by the mid-1990s, some of the outcomes from the Celtic Tiger era were becoming very evident. There were huge inequalities are being exacerbated between the urban, essentially metropolitan, versus the other parts of the country. And that was becoming a source of political tension, as well as in the private sector. Even the Chambers of Commerce recognised that we couldn't continue as it was, which was unusual for them. So that got me thinking, and I developed a kind of personal commitment to promoting a new approach. I thought that was necessary. And the first opportunity to do that, and this comes to the issue of networking. How do you get it started? The first opportunity that I got was in 1995. A new approach for rural areas was prepared by the National Economic and Social Council, and they chose to launch it in Dublin Castle. And I got invited to provide the keynote talk at the launch. And it was a tremendous opportunity. It was packed with leaders from across various sectors and government departments. And a key issue in that report was the need to situate rural within a spatial framework that included urban and rural. So I essentially opened up that agenda. And then immediately people started picking up that point. And I was involved with the Regional Studies Association, and we ran conferences to promote that idea, but more importantly, we invited senior officials from the Taoiseach's department, from finance and other departments, where the people who were making the decision, we got them to come and speak at our conferences and to listen to what we were saying, because we had found out previously we were talking to the wrong people. We were talking to people too far down the line. So the important thing was to get in at the top and to get the message across. That led to discussions with the National Economic and Social Council, because I saw that as a forum where you had all of the big stakeholders around the table, but there was no geographer involved. There never had been one. The outside people were economists, and so it took quite a while to persuade the Taoiseach's department to appoint a geographer onto the NESC. And one of our first tasks in there was to prepare a long-term 10-year strategy for the country. And it included a chapter on a national infrastructure strategy, which was a spatial strategy in outline. So that was an important part of networking, in that it got the buy-in of the key productive stakeholders, but also the trade unions and the third sector. The next important piece of work was in the lead up to the NDP, starting from late 2009 onwards, the Department of Finance commissioned the ESRI to prepare a national priorities investment programme to identify what should be in the NDP. Now, that was typically prepared by economists and nobody else. For some reason, I managed to get onto that committee. And importantly, for the first time ever, we got a chapter written in on the priorities that was headed spatial planning. And in the NDP, for the first time, there was a chapter on regional planning. So, but that was a very significant report, in that it carried the weight of the ESRI into the Department of Finance, and then it got into the NDP. So I think the important lesson thing from that is the need to be proactive in trying to network at a very high level, if one can get there, to convince the people who are in a position to make these decisions and to try and influence them. Later on then, the NDP committed establishing a national spatial strategy. I was asked to become part of the expert advisory group, and I got in on that. And I think you mentioned the research program, which I drafted the outline of that, and that effectively led on to the beginnings of that process. Now, but what could I and people working with me in Maynooth, what did we bring to the process? The first thing I think we brought was we're trying to introduce some novel perspectives on territorial development. These were emerging at the European level, and they hadn't yet filtered into the discussion here. We brought in maps, new types of maps at a very small ED level, and of representing rural Ireland and representing urban Ireland in ways that had not been portrayed before. They really caught the attention of people, and they couldn't come from any other profession. We were the subject who could do that. We introduced the notion of functional areas, which we take for granted, that activities are organised in space, but don't take account of administrative boundaries. That was a real challenge for people in local authorities. They tend to think within their boundaries, and here we were saying to them, the problems are often cross-boundary, and you have to find ways of working across the boundaries. So that had to get onto the table. And another bogey issue was the notion of balanced regional development. That had been around for decades and was very poorly articulated and misrepresented. It was represented as an issue about spatial equity. Between, you didn't even use the word spatial, as equity between regions. And it was argued against on the grounds that equity probably meant less efficiency in the allocation of resource. So there was always a strong counter-argument against it. Now, what we tried to do here was to move away from that argument and focus on the potential of different areas, and to recognise that not all places are the same, but they each have some potential, and to build a framework to try and harness those different potentials. So there are important conceptual pieces that we were bringing to the table, which weren't being brought by anybody else, I think, at the time. And how did the relationship then develop, I might ask? I think I have jotted down a few points here. From the very start, our focus was on what I call a transformative change rather than a transactional. This was a big project of long-term nature, and it had to be broad in scope, and they had to find ways of pulling it all together. So that was the broad focus. It was underpinned, and Niall mentioned this, a shared commitment from our side and from the department side on enhancing the delivery of public goods, and putting it very broadly. There was, for us, a key issue, and it was a strength for us, was that we had to build trust with the people we were dealing with. So there was a lot of commitment to building trust, enhancing credibility, and observing mutual respect. So we had to get to know each other and discover ways of working together and be constructively critical of each other from times. And also, I think part of what we tried to do was to find ways of cultivating an openness to innovation. What had been tried in the past wasn't working, and it wasn't a case of just tinkering around with it. Something much more radical was needed, and that required an opening up to innovation. And the last thing that I was aware of there was always to be respectful of the boundaries between our role as advisors and the decision-making roles of the politicians and their advisors. There were important boundaries there, and sometimes we would have different views, and compromises were needed, or decisions were made that we just didn't like, but we had to put up with it. Now, what were the outcomes? I'll just focus on the main outcome was the National Spatial Strategy in 2002, and I won't go into the details of that, but it was broad. A lot of things flew from it, including a national spatial data infrastructure that has evolved over the years. That was one of the recommendations in the NSS, based on our experience of preparing the research for it. For the outcomes for the university, I think the most obvious outcome for the university was it raised the profile of Maynooth immensely in Ireland and across Europe as the key centre of expertise in spatial planning. Now, that was quite an achievement for the university and an important one at the time. NURSA was in an early stage of development. Maynooth did not have a planning department or planning school. Other universities did. And here we had crept into a space that really wasn't ours. But we internationally, Maynooth was seen as the place where it was happening. I think from this engagement, what I describe it as positive and durable relationships were developed for engagement, so that the personal relationship, but also the institutional relationships, they were built upon that early experience, and they have lasted. It was important for NURSA as a brand to be associated with that particular national initiative. And there was also some research income coming directly from the department, but more importantly, through the work that we were doing, it was an important sort of input into applications for research funding from elsewhere. You know, it enhanced the reputation of the institution. At a personal level for me, because there has to be some personal benefits, there's a lot of work involved doing these kind of things. For me, that was tremendous satisfaction of having a role in preparing something that I thought might be transformative. The relationships with the public servants and the capacity to achieve reforms was something that I very much valued. Locally in the university, it enhanced my opportunities to bring real world experiences back into the class hall in terms of especially postgraduate teaching. There were frustrations. The biggest one, I suppose, was the breakdown of the coherent political commitment, which we thought we had achieved in the preparation of the NSS, but when it came to implementation, it evaporated in some instances. The most obvious one being the input of the Minister for Finance, the cancellation of the dedicated funding for innovation, in the lead up to around the time of fiscal crisis. But that led then to an abandonment of the NSS principles. And worse still, that fed into a negation of the need for an NSS. That was a really bad outcome at that time, that, you know, it wasn't just to stop the funding, but they gave up on thinking about it. And began to almost convince themselves, well, do we need it at all? And this was coming from particularly some of the independent economic advisors who hadn't been part of the process, but were very quick to throw balls at it. Personally, I suppose the frustrations, I felt that I sacrificed time that I might have used for publishing some of the results. You know, Rob has been far better at this than I was. But on the other hand, some of the papers I wrote, I think, had much more impact than some of the papers I published in journals at other times. You know? So I got some benefit from that. And the last personal thing I noted was what I described as the tyranny of very detailed mapping. The very detailed mapping was hugely important in creating an awareness of the problems and the diversity of things as a big image. The problem was people took these maps away and they looked in at their individual EDs and they wanted to say, why is this one different from the other one? And the local picture occluded the big picture. And I think that is still an issue in terms of how maps are used by non-specialists and and the understanding what's behind them. So the conclusions I would draw for one last moment. The construction of a durable, transformative engagement requires a high level of sustained commitment by all partners over a number of years. It's not something that comes about quickly. There has to be some broad vision of what you want to achieve and then just working away at it. I think it's important to be clear on what you can bring to the table and what is different from what others might be bringing. Establish your niche so that you'll get respect for that and you'll get asked to do things that nobody else can do, or at least can do as good as you can do them. The benefits, there are benefits to the university profile at national and international level, but there are costs as well, like especially opportunity costs for people involved, in that they forego time that they might spend doing other things. So they need to be outweighed against that. And that brings me to the kind of the university. The university need to have greater clarity, I think, around this whole notion of which is now being talked about, greater involvement in policy development. There needs to be clarity around workload models, around promotion schemes, around teaching buyouts for limited periods, and for participation of external collaborators in quality assurance reviews. To mention just a few things, that these are important inputs into that process if it's to work. It's not a simple add-on to what people normally do. It has to be built in to the institution. But having said all that, my conclusion is it was worthwhile.
It was fun.
I enjoyed it. Yeah.
Thanks, Jim.
Okay.
Thanks very much to the two of you and to Jim for those, I suppose, very, very detailed reflections building actually on what came first. And I think what we can see here is a journey and not a straight line, a journey of a group of people in Maynooth working with groups of people like Niall. So I'm going to open it up now, and for whether online for writing it down or for comments or reflections. So don't feel you have to ask a question if you want to come in. Quite happy for you to have a reflection on particularly the approaches that have been used in this journey over time of impacting change. And I was very taken by learning and change, and both of you used both of those words in different ways, learning and change, and one been linked to the other, and the need for both. So opening it up here in person. Anybody want to come in? You might say who you are.
Yes. Thanks, Seán. Hi, I'm Keith Moynes. I'm a civil servant in the Department of Further and Higher Education, and I'm a geographer by training. So the question is some sort of from both dimensions. What I was interested in terms of process was, public policy areas where there's real connectivity to the spatial dimension, like planning, capital investment. So there's a real, there's been that enhanced understanding and use of geographical research, spatial research. Just interested in your thoughts on either state of the art or potential for connectivity into other areas where there are spatial dimensions, but they perhaps aren't as close. Poverty, justice, social issues, economic issues.
Yeah, so I mean, we'd have done work on all those things you've just mentioned. So I think we've done work for 15 out of the 16 government departments at one point or another, various contracts. So it doesn't matter whether it's justice, transport, environment, housing, education, particularly through the aero work, but actually quite a bit through ICLRD work, because the spatial is cross-sectoral. So, there's a spatial logic to how the education system's organised, how transport systems organised, how they're whatever. So yeah, we have done work across those different sectors. Mostly building tools, actually, mostly building the kind of the mapping tools. There's been some kinds of policy kinds of work, I guess, from, particular researchers who might, so Chris at the back will have done stuff, I guess, more relating to trade, business, spatial patterns around that, and investment patterns, foreign direct investment, SME, all of that kind of stuff, feeding into work with the IDA Enterprise Ireland. We didn't work for both of those in the past, and stuff. So yeah, no, we don't just stick on the spatial planning directly there. If we can contribute somewhere else, then we will. And a lot of the kinds of stuff, like even within like the housing and planning kind of thing, often has these cross. You'll know yourself in the civil service, has these cross panels relating to them. So you go to like a housing meeting and there'll be people from each government department there, or several other government departments there, plus the CSO, plus OPR, plus whoever. Then they don't. There's enough kind of bridging kinds of things going.
I think in the planning world, I think you've touched on a very, very important point. The planning world certainly has upped its game, significantly around the interaction with the capital infrastructure side. I can put my finger, within a very short period of time on critical needs in water services, public transport, the whole placemaking, physical public realm, all that sort of stuff, you know, has advanced hugely in terms of our thinking and on how we deliver. Environmentally as well, you know, look at the whole interaction between climate and planning now, you know, kind of adaptation, mitigation, etc. It's all over the planning sector now. Biodiversity, nature restoration, and so on. If you like, the poor cousin in all of that is the actual social area. Look at things, for example, like as simple as playing fields and active amenity space. We don't have any nationally determined yardsticks in relation to, well, as we densify our cities and we build more apartments and compact growth and all of that sort of stuff, how do we actually measure that all the people that are living in more compact spaces actually have access to, you know, the physical amenities and so on? I was discussing this with the GAA and other sporting organizations recently. So there's work to be done in relation to whether this is all landing, you know, appropriately. I would say that in the education space, that certainly has, you know, and good to see you, it has evolved a lot, the whole interaction between spatial planning and schools planning. Seán knows a little bit about that, and the whole memorandum of understanding between the local government system, you know, that's come on leaps and bounds. But there are areas of understanding social and community need and how that feeds into the planning process, which has become much more rules-based. You know, it's all now about head sheds and, you know, public transport catchments and sustainable urban drainage and building heights and overshadowing, and, you know, so we're in this much more complex system now of many different rules and parameters that we used in sort of determining what's the best. But there are significant areas of social culture, you know, cultural needs at community level, cultural space, you know, which is becoming a real issue in many of our urban areas, particularly in Dublin City, as, you know, that some of the more lower intensity, lower value from the economic perspective, not in the social or cultural sense, gets squeezed out by more profitable, in effect, land uses. We see that everywhere. So I wouldn't say it's a blind spot. I think that would be a bit too harsh. But it's an area that we need to focus our attention in. So, you know, maybe in terms of the research community, you know, I said just on that area of active amenity space, and what are the yardsticks we use to ensure that, you know, people will be able to have, you know, sporting opportunities, and no, not by driving out to the outside the M50. How do we deal with that? You know, we're a bit weaker on that. So that's more homework maybe for organizations like ourselves. But again, venues like this are really good opportunities, you know, to have interactions between different disciplines, different areas, in the context of saying, yeah, there's a learning, there's an insight here, and we've got to bring some change about it. So it's a really good question.
Yeah.
Just two thoughts. One is there's a commitment to prepare a national land use strategy, and there's a need to bring together inputs from various quarters to address climate issues, to address infrastructural issues, to address the management of land, and so on. And I think that's a space that it needs interdisciplinary inputs, and there's quite a bit of expertise in Maynooth that could feed into that process. I think that's one sort of broad area. The other one that strikes me is in regard to higher education, and this might sound strange coming from somebody who was vice president of a university for a long time, but we have quite a lot of universities now around the country. Some have been rebranded from their former life. There's an unwritten expectation that they will all contribute in some way or other to their regions and boost development in their hinterlands. That's a topic that has attracted a huge amount of international attention. It's not clear to me that that there's a strategy that it goes beyond being transactional. That a lot of what happens in some of these, they're projects, which in some cases have no local impact. In other cases, they have very direct local impacts. But I don't see a sort of broader kind of transformative framework for how the different components of higher education can contribute to other societal goals, like the kind of goals that are within the NPF. there. And that's something I think that may be worth exploring further, in terms of where are we going. And I always recall the leader of one of the larger universities one time making the remark that cooperation and collaboration is good, but competition is far more exciting. And essentially, he could say that from his position, but for others, it wasn't such a nice thing to be hearing.
Or do you want Mark is going to come in next, if that's okay, and I'll come back to the
Yeah, just a quick question to both Niall and Rob. Brilliant hearing all the background and the history, and a little bit nostalgic walk down memory lane. But thinking now from here on and moving into the future, I'd maybe like to hear you say a little bit more about the next generation of evidence-based planning and what that looks like. We know the Irish government is turning towards this through the Civil Service Research Network. We know Rob's imagining all sorts of new data practices and so on. Justin has made a point there that we're unrecognisable from what we were 18 years ago, but by definition we'll be unrecognisable again in 18 years' time from what we are just now. So a little bit of scoping about what comes next now, having heard what we've done up to now, and have you any thoughts on innovative out of the box?
There's a quick one for me, Mark, just conscious of time. It's just the whole digital in planning space. Planning's been hugely paper-based up to now, up to very recently. The online planning application system that is now up and running pretty much across the system has gone from a penetration level of effectively 0, which small number of authorities had online planning application systems, to heading towards 80%. So 80% now of customers, if you like, who interact with the planning service in terms of their applications are interacting digitally. And there's a new planning administration system coming right behind it, which will integrate the 3 different systems that are used by local authorities: the data mining, the AI, all of that space, the opportunity, digital visualization, the collision between the gaming sector and the mapping sector, to create, incredibly innovative tools that, can be used now to, trying to explain to somebody in a, with a 2-dimensional drawing what a 3-dimensional thing is going to look like. It's a hard one. We're trained to do it instinctively, but so these are tools that now. So to what additional purposes can that be put to? What efficiencies does that bring to us? As I often say, we have 1,500 people working in planning authorities around the country. We have probably the best part of 70, 80, 90, 100 people whose only job of a day is to check that every dot and I and T of a form is filled out and the right fee was calculated and so on. So they're literally running around with a scale ruler and calculator. It's mind-numbing work that really should be replaced by machines, subject to quality checks and so on. So that whole space around digital, AI, planning in a digital world, we've only just, and I think, I don't know that much about, Research Ireland and all these structures and buyouts and so on, but I just think, and we had some interactions with researchers from the University of Ulster. Bertrand will know of this earlier on this week. And I think the idea of, from a public service innovation, in terms of buyouts, getting maybe some of the leading thinkers in universities to work with us, there's something in that that's really, really rich. I don't know how to envisage it, but I think it needs to be.
Well, I think that vision is there, Niall. It's brilliant, and you use the word venue, quite a lot, which is, I think, a really interesting concept. So the question is, are we conscious of the venues we need to convene moving forward to enable access to the expertise required to address those issues? Maybe Rob might be able to say something on your project and whether you provide that intelligence.
Yeah, well, we did the work with the LGMA on the reform on the planning IT system. So that's a very clear kind of policy link with the kinds of work that we were doing on that work. I mean, I agree with Justin. Like it is unrecognizable, and obviously things like air codes and the georeferencing of the data has made a big difference. Well, where it could potentially go, like, first of all, like, we still need to sort out the evidence base. I mean, our project is all about housing and planning data, and it's coming. It's coming, but it still needs a lot more work, right? And like AI works on training data, and our training data is not great, right? So like, unless we fix that out, the AI stuff's not happening, right? Or we'll just have really, really crap AI, you know. So the evidence base still needs to get fixed to really get the payoffs. I think like that's definitely going to happen. At the minute, we're still at mapping. So we basically produce a lot of maps. What we're not doing is simulation modeling and data driven, like taking the data and doing something interesting and useful with it, as opposed to just mapping it, right? So we need to get beyond that, right? So and we need to get like playing around with things, you know. So I think like just as working on like the ESM with Anoia and so on is kind of moving towards that, but we need more of that basically. So maybe that's where we will be, and there'll be loads of other tech coming in, like prop tech coming in, and other kinds of areas in the private sector. Probably won't come in the public sector in the same way, but yeah, there'll definitely be changes. You know, my big fear is that we'll still just be doing maps in 20 years' time, and we won't have got beyond that. We definitely need to get beyond just presenting data.
Jobs. Keep the maps going.
No, but the job can still do like geosimulation and modeling and doing more interesting things with the data than just displaying it. Like that's where we need to go on that side.
And for anybody who doesn't know, Rob is a great sci-fi writer too, and all interested in those sorts of things, and has done this, has pulled together different ideas around looking forward about what things we'll look at and getting different people to write it up in different contexts. There's some really interesting work there. So I'm going to open it up to the floor, and I'm just going to take everybody who's got their hand up if they could talk rather than have responses.
Quick one. So yeah, Anna Gallagher, Cahill TG Care, and formerly Cahill of Withers and for 10 years. It's a question really for Rob. In terms of when you're developing papers to feed into policy development, how do you also develop a potential implementation plan with timelines as part of it? Because it seems to me that the most useful policies and the most credible policies are those that
I can answer that quickly. The last time we did that, we were very clearly instructed by the civil servants that that's not our job. Our job is to say what the issue is and so on. We suggested solutions and an implementation plan, and we were told to take it out very clearly, to take it out. That was not our role. It comes back to role agreements and responsibilities and so on. So yeah, we definitely have ideas and we definitely express them. But they don't necessarily end up in the final reports.
Sorry, Miriam Ryan, Maynooth University, working in the Research Development Office. And it's very interesting, the two stories we've heard here of how you develop, and they're quite individual at the same time. You went and you're a speaker, and you are in an institution, and the institution itself has those centers that you kind of piggyback on and use, which is very important. But how would I, as a young researcher, now if I'm a young early career researcher, I look to Research Ireland and I say, well, okay, I've got calls, I can see what's there. How do I know? How do I understand or get in? Is there a plan within government, and maybe there's nobody here who can actually answer this, that if I'm in education, well, I know that the Department of Education has this evidence-based plan, and they will be looking for 3 or 4 or 5 reports to be done, or as part of a bigger thing. Is there any sort of joined up thinking as to say at the start of a 5-year or a 3-year, what's going to be looked for? And I understand it's dynamic and different things happen within a space of a number of years. Just a question.
Yeah, far away.
Thanks very much. My name is Lorraine Darcy. I'm TU Dublin Sustainability Action Research and Innovation Lead. And my kind of question is looking for a bit of sage advice on, I'll stand up so I can see. I suppose like one of our challenges, and I suppose I'm kind of putting this in the TU context as a new university, where we're looking at our workload allocation, and we're trying to look at how do we justify going from a very heavy teaching load where we would have done a lot of engagement in community, but wouldn't, and produced reports, not necessarily academic papers. And we would have built up that trust over years, and where we would have had, coming back to your transactional and piece. But in the light of research, funding, and particularly in relation to research centres, and excuse me for anyone who's in one, they're a little bit of old boys clubs and closed doors, and it's very difficult to break into those when you're trying to, you know, when you're coming in. And we often say that like government departments are siloed. I think academia is, and like I've worked in the transdisciplinary space, I've been across different disciplines, and I've never felt like so many barriers and doors are up for us doing transdisciplinary work. So I'd love to hear how you think, you know, particularly in the light of change in the education system at the moment, in the higher education system, in light of as well with like Research Ireland now, how we can work towards more transformative change. To anyone really, but particularly yourself. Yeah.
Yeah. You're okay, right? Are you sure?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's a good
Yeah,
conversation.
okay, fire ahead, Rob. Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, take Miriam's first point around getting started and knowing what's going on. So, I mean, that does come down a little bit to you as the researcher to take kind of charge of yourself to a certain degree of, I'm going to go and find out. Like all of us, a lot of us in the room here are professional researchers, like go and do some research. Like go and find out what the programs are, go and find out what's happening within the agencies, go and talk to people in the departments about, you know, schemes that might be coming along, and so on. I do think it's the latter thing though. I think trying to jump straight into a government department without kind of doing smaller steps first is a big leap, you know. So it's like you know, I wouldn't start by just trying to get involved in a like Department of Education program right from the get-go, unless you're going to do that with collaborators. So I think collaborators are a really good thing. Like the easiest way to get your first research grant is to collaborate with somebody who's got a history of getting research grants, and then learn to become a PI and learn how you do project management, learn how you do the admin around it, learn how the systems of the university work and how your partners work. I mean, that's, you know, kind of what I was doing with Jim and doing with Brendan and doing with Punches and other people was kind of leveraging off of that basically. And we were keeping an eye out on what was going, you know, what kind of tenders were coming up and what kind of, and we would do some groundwork. So we wouldn't apply for things cold. We would go to seminars and workshops, and at any event where they were doing like a briefing seminar, we would go. And we would go and talk to people, and we would kind of prepare the ground. We would prepare the ground. We wouldn't ever like apply cold, which if you're a lone researcher can be difficult, right? But like, which kind of comes to the second point about the centres and the institution. Like, now I can only talk for our institute in a sense, right? But we actively try to make this an open, inclusive space, and we have all kinds of programs, right? So it's like all the senior researchers in here are contributing money into pots that will fund starter grants, seed grants, visiting stuff, workshops, events. Like there's a real benefit to being involved in the institute. Like we want people to join. We don't want barriers, and it's like it's our thing and it's only our thing and you can't have it. Like we actually want to try and share it. We want to share it out, you know, and things like media requests or whatever, we'll share those out with whoever's the most suitable person rather than just whoever. So I'd like to think that's a cultural thing that like centres and institute, but I do know that some people have their own little thing and there's like 3 of them in a little unit and they basically, you know, they just operate as their own little thing and so on. That's really not going anywhere. Like there's a reason why this institute occupies the entirety of this floor and has over 100 whatever members and has got 50 or 60 open projects, funded projects at any one time. You know, is because we go out of our way to try and make that happen. But that has to be an institutional thing. Like that has to be institution as in the university kind of directing that's the kind of centres and institutes that you want, and you incentivize it and you find ways of doing it. But it also has to be in the culture of the unit itself, you know, that you have an ambition about that. And, you know, like I try to do that. It's difficult, right? Because like, you know, there are institutional politics, and like there was definitely a politics around NERSA when it kind of started, and who was involved and who wasn't, and what money and all this kind of stuff, right? And then Mark was director, and Linda has been director for a while, and Linda would very much see that as her role, is to try and kind of grow and maintain the institute. But it is coming off that core of that original thing, and the benefits of the university is enormous, right? I don't know what it is. It's I don't know, anywhere between 50 and 100 million euros of research money into the university through, like, that's like, it pays off, right?
And to the point around, is there a strategy? I should have mentioned, we do have the National Planning Knowledge Group as part of the OPR. We have a very wide range of researchers from right across this island represented on that. It is also sort of multidisciplinary to a degree. Yeah, we're actually just about to draw up our next, if you like, because we're only 5 years in existence, and we're coming to the end of our research program. And I think the way we've done it is quite innovative, because I suppose only a small part of our approach is to directly fund pieces of research, because we very much want to piggyback on the fact that there's an enormous amount of work going on in the EPA, in a whole range, Research Ireland, other entities. So it's on our website in terms of how we do it, and very much to echo Rob's point and build on something that Jim said earlier. It's easy for me to say, and I mentioned earlier about walking into the shoes. I think researchers should feel confident and very much welcomed in terms of reaching out to other areas of professional discipline, etc. I think there is an eagerness, there is a hunger, etc. But maybe sometimes the strictures of teaching and research can get in the way. But going to conferences, going to seminars like this, indeed, venues, whether virtual or in person, making the linkages with local groups or local entities that you'll be aware of, getting those sort of connections built, getting the name about a little bit, and I suppose out of those individual little acorns comes the much bigger piece of maybe collaborating on a piece of research. Then you're part of a call, or you're on a national planning knowledge group, whatever. I think
this idea of the venue and the is important. Like, and Jim mentioned it earlier on about like the workshops and inviting the policymakers into the workshop and all that kind of. That's really useful. Like, it's just really useful to have the conversation, either over coffee, over lunch, over, like, a lot of the networking goes on outside of like just the talking now, right? It's like when you meet afterwards and so on, and they're really useful. And we would do that in different places. So like we would hold events in the city centre, because we know it's going to be difficult to get people to come out here. So like we will do that, like if needs be, or we'll partner. So like our workshop in 2 weeks' time is in the CSO, and it's joint with the CSO, and it's deliberately there and not here, because we know the senior civil servants are much more likely to go there than here. It's a deliberate thing.
We have a day job.
Yeah.
Jackie was calling me.
Yeah.
There's something buzzing in here all the time.
Yeah.
2 minutes.
I'm just going to finish up. I just want to say first that there's a question there about what departments are doing, and we're featuring in this series an example of what one of the departments is doing in the Department of Climate and Environment, and each of the government departments in different ways is undertaking different things, all within the overall government policy and networking together in the Civil Service Research Network, and they're all moving on and advancing and changing and trying out things. For example, next week the Department of Education has an event to try and seek to involve researchers in how it's going about its business long run, and has invited lots of different, and they're having a kind of a thought piece about how they should be doing that with the researchers. So that's just an example. So there's a number of different things going on, and we're picking up on some of them in this series. This has been really great. Before we close, Mark, do you want to add a few words?
I would love to add a few words, but I don't think Niall's going to take the time.
I'm okay. I'm okay for another 10 minutes.
He's already
I've already missed that train. I will be late.
I don't want to actually say too much. I think this is fascinating, absolutely fascinating. We're looking at how to create brokering mechanisms within universities and departments, and there's all sorts of ways of doing it. But this is Jim uses the word transformation rather than transactional. It's a biographical approach. It's seeing this as a lifelong investment in someone, and that is, you know, if we have in Maynooth to create the next generation of high impact academics with high impact public policy, would we provide the odd training course, or would we, what we, no, we wouldn't. We'd be looking to inculcate a vision and a CV of people incrementally at the foot of a PI, initially learning and mentoring and so on for a lifelong development. It's not about training somebody up to write a policy brief or training somebody to, translate a finding into a kind of workshop. All those are important skills, but it's the biographical investment in the person actually as part of their career. I think that's deep investment in individuals. And the problem with that is hypermobility in academia means people come and go. So you need to get people to plug and play. People like Rob and Niall are unusual in many ways. They've been in these roles and so on, and that relationship's allowed to blossom and develop. So whether we invest into people and then lose that return on that investment is that. But I think that deep investment in building personal capacity is a different way of universities thinking about scaling the impact.
I don't worry about the churn. I won't worry about the churn. If you think of the number of people who've been through this floor in the last 20 whatever years, it's probably over 500. Like there are some people who kind of stay and they anchor, like, I don't know, like me, you, Linda, or whatever. And then there are people who churn through. And I don't think the churn matters. It's a question of continuity and change, as long as you manage to keep the continuity.
Sometimes that leads to a process of evangelization beyond a need,
Yeah, and all of those people going off just become part of your alumni and part of your extended network wherever they've gone, right? That's like
it's the brain drain versus brain drain, brain circulation.
What you can't do is let it die though. Like there has to be a process of keeping it alive and keeping it, keeping it going.
By keeping it relevant and current. So like when you think about, I suppose, the various tentacles of this floor and institution, and indeed other parts of the university, and where that feeds into environmental policy, housing policy, planning policy, and load of other things, social education, etc. And that creates then, the culture whereby, two secondary school teachers in Navan who have this young lad who's talking about planning or architecture, whatever to say, you need to go to Maynooth because they're the best people at that.
Yeah. I just wonder when the next train after the one you were going to get.
10 past 4. 10 past.
So look, that's been really good. I think it's the values that you've demonstrated, but also some idea of where they came from and some idea of how you're trying to pass them on, both in academia and in government. And that's what I take from this. And then so many different ideas about how to do that. And that's been really, really great. Thanks to the two of you and indeed the three of you for being so open, and it's really, really helpful just to sort of share that experience with people so that can help them reflect on the journey. So